All right. Well, you've seen this before, the American Revolution and the restoration of the gospel. That's what we've been talking about for 4 days. And I hope in some ways it's rekindled a love in your heart for the founding of America. Thank you. It's rekindled it in my heart every time I talk about it. Every time I think about it and read about it. And, you know, I own a lot of books, and it's a real disease. And I just keep ordering more books. And they'll come. My wife says, "Don't you own enough books?" I say, "I own a lot of books, honey, but not this one." And she says, "Haven't you read enough about the Revolution?" I said, "Well, almost. If I can just read this book." So I love to read about it. I love these people. I love what they did. I love everything about them. And I'm grateful that you've kind of been here to take this ride. Okay, let's go here. A quick review. Just things that have been talked about. It doesn't matter if you weren't here for all 4 days. It's insignificant. But we talked about Christopher Columbus, 1492. He was 328 years before the first vision. And we kind of use that as the jumping off place, okay? Columbus, 328, before the first vision. The Lord's doing everything by divine design. 1620, Pilgrims arrive in Plymouth. This is 200 years before the first vision. 150 years later, 1776, Declaration of Independence. That's just 44 years before the first vision. And then 13 years later, the writing and approval of the Constitution. Just 33 years before the first vision. We're going to talk today about the War of 1812 and what that meant to America, how that worked for them. The War of 1812 ends in 1815. That's simply 5 years before the first vision. That's all it is, 5 years before the first vision. And then in 1820, of course, the first vision and the restoration of the gospel in this nation, founded under the inspiration of God Almighty. And this nation chosen, allowed to be the host country for the restoration of the gospel. So we're very grateful for that. But let's talk about now the War of 1812. We are separated from England. We did that. We have formed a country with the enactment of the Constitution. We did that. We have a president as of April of 1789. And we have a legislative body. The restoration is scheduled to begin formally in just 31 years from when the president was elected. Is there anything left to do in planning, in preparing for the restoration? Well, America is just a brand new baby nation. They had to sit at the kids' table for a long time. Just a brand new little baby nation. But America wants to be a big boy nation. They want to have respect from other nations. And they want to have equal footing with other nations. And they're tired of being pushed around, especially by England. England wouldn't stop pushing around America. All right? And America just feels like we've got to establish ourselves. We've got to be taken seriously. In 1812, America is now a confederation, a nation of 18 still fairly loose states, but they're all in this thing together. And they declared war on Great Britain. All right? It's like a couple of guys driving old Volkswagens going up against tanks. They declared war on Great Britain. We're tired of you guys pushing us around. And the main reason they declared war was an issue called impressment. Impressment. That is, England is a navy nation. England's got an army, but England really has a navy. And England always needs men to man their ships. They're not getting enough enlistees. They're not getting enough of what they need. So how do they fill up their quota of people that we need to sail these ships, which was a pretty labor-intensive thing? They had what they called press gangs who would go along the waterfront, go into bars and taverns, and when guys were sitting there pretty drunk, they'd just capture them, kidnap them. And guys would wake up on a ship out in the ocean, and they'd say, "You're now a sailor." That's how they'd fill up their quota. This is how we get guys we need. They would, when they'd stop other ships on the high seas, if anybody had an English accent, they'd take them onto their ship. If anybody had an Irish or a Scottish accent, onto their ship. That's how they filled up their quota of what they needed. If you have your Book of Mormon, look in Alma 54:23. Just to give you this little reference, this might help you understand this reference. In Alma 54:23. Somebody have that? Can I borrow your phone and read it, sister? I left my Book of Mormon in this room yesterday, and now it's in the lost and found. But I'm going to go find it today. 54:23. I am Amaron, and a descendant of Zoram, whom your fathers pressed and brought out of Jerusalem. He's talking about impressment. Remember Zoram, you could make a case that he was forced to go. And that's the case that Amaron's making. They grabbed him, they twisted his arm, they said, "Come with us." He said, "Okay." Whom your fathers pressed. Joseph Smith's writing this in the 1820s. Joseph Smith knows about impressment because it's an issue. So he uses that word. And that was the issue for the War of 1812. Impressment. Great Britain could have easily crushed us. Easily. They had a massive army, massive navy. We're playing with tinker toys. We're trying to build up, but not yet. Okay? Great Britain could have easily crushed us, but they were busy with Napoleon Bonaparte. They had all their forces locked up on the continent with Napoleon Bonaparte. So they couldn't really turn to us and crush us. But eventually they finished being involved in the Napoleonic Wars. When they finally turned to us, we were no longer fighting for seamen's rights, but for the right to exist as a country. We wanted Great Britain to know, we are a nation. And you better quit pushing us around. All right? We are big and bold. We weren't, but they wanted them to know that. And so Great Britain, they engaged. A great front of the war, a great theater of the war was up in Canada, in Toronto, in that area. Toronto used to be called York, and the American Army invaded York, and they burnt the Parliament building, the government building. They burnt it. They felt like this was their right. Great Britain would never forget that assault on their government temple. So they came after us. And there was a lot of battles and a lot of skirmishes, but here are two you should know about. One is the British Navy sailed up the Chesapeake Bay and then sailed up the Potomac River up close to Washington. Close. And their army got off the boat, and we are going to go invade Washington, D.C. That's the plan. And that's exactly what they did. James Madison was a president, and this British Army got closer and closer and closer to the White House. And eventually, everybody in the White House fled. Nobody stayed anywhere to defend anything. And the army gets close to the White House. Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, she was tough. She said, later on, writing about her experience, "If I could have had a cannon through every window. But alas, those who should have placed them there fled before me, and my whole heart mourned for my country." She wanted a cannon in every window of the White House, and she probably would have gone and lit them. But she said those that should have put them there, they were gone. So we were pretty much stuck. Dolly Madison got every bit of state papers that she could take out into this carriage. So those papers were saved and taken away. And you've probably heard the story of how she saved the portrait of George Washington. She said, "We are not going to let the British burn that." But they couldn't get it off the wall, and it was, it's big. And so she said, "Just break the frame." And they took the painting and rolled it up, and away they went. She saved it. She saved possessions, but not everything. Then she got away, and President Madison got away maybe less than an hour before he would have been captured. They all just abandoned it. The British came, they go inside the White House. Wander around the White House. What do they find in the dining room? A meal had been prepared. They were going to have some kind of feast. And they said, "We found a table with 40 places set." And they said, with 40 covers, meaning covers on the dishes to keep the food warm. So the soldiers came in and said, "Well, we might as well eat." Take the covers off. They all ate. They drank all the wine. They felt pretty good. Then they torched the White House. And one of their generals said, "The sailors are really good at setting fires." And they just went through the White House and set a fire here and a fire here and a fire here. Burn it. Burn it to a shell of what it was. Then they went down to the Treasury building, burnt that. Then they went to other buildings and burnt that. And the locals went down to the Navy Yard, the Washington Navy Yard, and they set it on fire. Because we don't want the British to take our ships. And they had a couple of ships being built. They burnt the hulls of them. I mean, the whole thing was on fire. The British just kind of came in and did what they did. And one of the reasons they wanted to burn the White House was, you burnt our parliament up in York. So, now we're going to burn your seat of government. And that's what they did. It was a pretty nasty thing. But war is a pretty nasty thing.
Was anyone killed?
Probably. Was anyone killed? Yeah, probably. Shots were fired, and so that's the War of 1812. How the British burnt the White House, which of course was eventually rebuilt, but they took care of business. Now, that was a great triumph for them. That was a great victory for them. And they loved it. They were so proud of what they had done. So what are we going to do next in this war? What are we going to do next? The next biggest prize, they had to sail down to the Chesapeake, back up the Chesapeake to Baltimore. Baltimore was like the queen city in that whole region. They just had goods and, cotton and produce and clothing and all sorts of stuff. And they said, if we can take Baltimore, we can capture all these goods, capture all their guns, and that'll be a real prize. So up they go. We've knocked out Washington. Let's knock out Baltimore. The difference was Washingtonians fled. The people of Baltimore dug. We're not going anywhere. We are not leaving at all. And they stayed to fight. And they fought, the fort that sits out there on the point is called Fort McHenry. Anybody been to Fort McHenry? Yeah, very interesting place. Okay? What's Fort McHenry most famous for? You get extra points if you know this. Star-Spangled Banner. Yeah. Francis Scott Key. But the British thought, we'll go up the bay, we'll anchor outside of there, and we'll knock out Fort McHenry. And when we do, Baltimore is ours. The goods, we can pillage, we can loot, we can do whatever we want to do. So they went up there. The people in Baltimore dug in. They had a lot of cannon in Fort McHenry. Here's the problem. Their cannon had a range of 2,000 yards. That's a long way. But the British ships had mortars with a range of 4,000 yards. So all we've got to do is anchor away. Their cannons won't be able to hit us, and we can just launch. We can just launch, and they'd launch these mortars that would explode in the night sky. And you'd see it'd be like, the 4th of July. Fireworks. And the British thought, we can just come up here, we can launch our mortars and take out Fort McHenry. All right, now here's the sidelight story to that. Francis Scott Key. All right, he is an attorney. And he is enlisted to go get the release for a doctor. A Dr. Beans. Beans was a doctor somewhere along that shore, and as the British came through, marching, the army, he pretended to be friends. And he fed them, da-da-da-da-da. And then when they left, he captured some of them at the tail end. Then they came back and realized he was duplicitous, and Dr. Beans was captured. And he was put out on a prison ship out in the bay with this armada. He's on a prison ship. Francis Scott Key. I'm thinking of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was named after Francis Scott Key. He's an attorney, and he was enlisted to go get the release of Dr. Beans. And he took another attorney with him. And they went out on this ship, and they negotiated back and forth and back and forth. And they had letters from some of the prisoners that Dr. Beans had kept, who all signed affidavits. He treated us wonderfully. He fed us. He did all sorts of things for us. And those affidavits, when presented to the British captors, turned the tide. And they said, okay, we'll let Dr. Beans go after we capture Baltimore. Not before, after. So there's Dr. Beans, there's Francis Scott Key, and there's his attorney friend, all on this ship for the whole night watching the bombardment back and forth and back and forth. Dr. Beans kept saying to Francis Scott Key, can you still see the flag? Because they had a flag, let me give you the number, that was 30 feet high, 42 feet wide. I don't know, what's this room? 60 feet wide? I'm guessing. 30 feet high, 42 feet wide. It would probably fill up this area pretty much. And that's the flag they ran up on the flagpole at Fort McHenry with this reasoning. We want to make sure the king sees it. The British see it. We're here. Well, launching all these mortars and rockets and bombs, it's just smoky. The air is just filled with smoke. Kind of like Provo this week, okay? Very smoky. And so Dr. Beans kept saying to F. Scott Key, Francis Scott Key. Can you still see the flag? Remember we saw it last night. Now it's dark. Can you still see it? They kept looking and looking. And in the morning, as the sunlight came up, Francis Scott Key says, I see it. It's right there. And the British must see it too. Fort McHenry held. They weren't going anywhere. And Francis Scott Key sat down and penned a little poem. Just the first verse of the little poem. Okay? And then when he got released, because then they did get released, he went on shore and filled out the poem. Penned a little bit more. Penned a little bit more. And eventually, I think it's 4 verses long. He got the whole thing written. It was put into a pamphlet. It was put into newspapers. It just spread around. And eventually in 1930, somewhere, became officially the anthem of the United States of America. And it all came from that Fort McHenry scenario. Just a few lines for it, or from it. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light, because they'd been up all night trying to spot the flag. Can you see it? Can you see it? So it's like Dr. Beans turned to him and said, hey, the sun's up. Can you see the thing that we so proudly hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Last night, as the sun was going out, or going down, we could see it. We could hail it. Hey, there's our flag. And then it gets dark. Now the sun's up. Can you still see it? Yes, it's still there. This line, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, all those mortars that the British shot. It was the 4th of July. It was large, okay? This line, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes or waits. It was silent around the British ships because the bombs, the rockets from Fort McHenry couldn't reach them at that time. So it was silent for them. It was horrible at Fort McHenry. And everything is just blowing up. Eventually the ships get closer and closer, trying to put better shots into the fort. And as they get closer, now these guns can reach the ships. And the tide starts to turn. Things start to change. So, they can see the flag. The British know they didn't do anything last night. We just didn't accomplish our goals. So you know what the British did? They sailed away. They just got in their ships and sailed away. They're gone. That was September of 1814. And by November, December of 1814, they had signed peace treaties. This war is over. We've always wondered, why didn't they stay and fight? Maybe they're sick of war. That's all they do. Maybe what?
They were kidnapped and forced to go anyway.
The British, why, you know, brother?
There's a story that because it was Henry, he had a very good guy that had been there a long time. And he said, the gunners on those ships, they said, we targeted that flagpole. And they said, we know we hit it. We know we hit it. And so inside the fort, they were taking cover down in the magazines and down below. And when they saw that the pole had been hit, the man would run out and hold that pole up. And 4 men went out to that pole. And in the morning when they saw that flag, the pole was angled off. And they said, we can't believe it's still there. It should be down there. So the men that sacrificed their lives knew what that symbol meant and how much it meant that that flag stayed there.
Yep. And it did. And it rallied them. And they saw it as a really powerful symbol. That thing is still standing. And you can almost feel the British going, dang, what do we got to do? And they just decided, we're done. They got in their ships, sailed down the Chesapeake Bay, out the Atlantic, and some went to Newfoundland, and some went down to Jamaica, and some went back to England, and that was it. That was it. In Baltimore, they dug in, and they beat them. And Fort McHenry, you can go take a tour of the place, and it's pretty impressive if you like impressive things like that. Now, that's almost the end of it. Almost the end of the war.
When was the third line changed?
When was the third line changed? Where the foes haughty host in dread sight. I think that's another verse. That's another verse. Yeah. It's always funny to be at church, 4th of July. We're going to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. Everybody stands up. First verse, we belt it out. Beyond that, nobody knows what's going on. Who's got a hymn book? Somebody share a hymn book with me. And very grateful for people that defend it. And I'm very grateful that I grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance every day in school, which I don't think happens much today.
Our school does it.
Do they?
Every day.
Is it because of you, Tayana?
Might be.
Okay.
I'm very strongly with that.
Okay. Yeah.
And we do say it, and we have a new principal goes, well, do we say it? They go, oh, yes, we do. And he looked at me and go, we say the pledge. What school is that? Southern California. We're from Chino.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. The only school in all of America that says it every day. That's right. Good job. Yes, ma'am.
Nampa, Idaho. Every elementary school says it.
Okay. Really?
No, they don't.
I've been wondering if anything good can come out of Nampa. And now I know. They're doing a great job. Yeah, there are pockets of it. But it seemed like it used to be universal. Yeah. Okay, so the treaties are signed and enacted, the end of the year, 1814. But Andrew Jackson, who will end up being the 7th president of the United States of America, is now a general in the army, and he's got an army down in New Orleans. And the British have an army down in New Orleans, and they're going to fight. They're going to fight in January of 1815. January 8th of 1815. Okay? Andrew Jackson's got his men down there. He knows the British are itching for a fight, and Andrew Jackson enlists a couple of pirates to help him. And, they're not beholden to anybody. But Andrew Jackson sweetens the pot, and the pirates come and help. Pirates of the Caribbean. They're right there fighting in the Battle of New Orleans, okay? And they get lined up. The American soldiers dig in, and the British are going to march across this field that's covered with fog. And they think, boy, that is good for us. We'll just zip, zip, zip. We'll just sneak in. The Americans won't know it. Well, Jackson's got his men all lined up. Now, mind you, the war's over. They've already signed all the peace treaties. The word just hasn't gotten to Andrew Jackson yet, or the British. They're still going to fight this battle. So in the morning, January 8th, 1815, the British come across, no cover, but the fog. And then the fog lifts. And the Americans just start picking them off. And in approximately 1 hour, the battle's over. Barely lasts an hour. And here's the casualty numbers. America, here's your casualty list. 13 dead, 39 wounded. British, 292 dead, 1,262 wounded, 484 taken prisoner. America lost 13, Great Britain lost a whole lot more than that. And the Great Britain, the British, the English generals said, we're done. They turned around, they sailed away. Okay, I suppose the pirates all sailed away. And America it's almost like, let's just put a nail in this thing. Bam. The war was signed off, the treaty, but we really finished it right here. It's over. And that was the end of it. We won. Little America, tiny America, we won.
Stephen Ambrose was showing a British officer in our time around New Orleans, and they got to the battle field there. And the officer he was with was a commander in the same unit that was so decimated in this battle. And he got tears in his eyes for the mayhem that happened to his unit.
You know, any kind of war is ugly. But I think it's uglier when you're on the losing side and you see so many comrades cut down. That's just the name of the game in war. And it was in New Orleans, so it was every other spot along the way. It was just ugly. All right. The War of 1812 was a search for national identity. You know, America, you're just feeling your oats. You know, you've got to establish yourself. You know, when you're a 6-year-old in your neighborhood on the street and bullies are pushing you around, you got to do something. And so America was we need our national identity. The United States was no longer a collection of independent states, but a title for a united nation. They were no longer the United States, all these guys. They are now the United States. That's us. That's who we are. We are the United States. With plenty of missteps, the U.S. had cast aside its cloak of colonial adolescence and stumbled forth onto the world stage. After the War of 1812, the United States was a singular term, not plural. The war had forged a nation. So by 1815, we've taken our place on the international stage, on the world stage, and the United States is now a player, destined to grow stronger, but right now a player. That's what happened with the War of 1812. Now, it ends in 1815. It's 5 years from the theophany in the Sacred Grove. It's just really, really close. Things had to be in place, and now they are in place. And in 5 years, I just think of what's passed, what's transpired. In 5 years, the Father and the Son will appear. And just get the restoration moving in New York. And everything was set up by divine design. Wilford Woodruff. Those men who laid the foundation of this American government and signed the Declaration of Independence were the best spirits the God of heaven could find on the face of the earth. They were choice spirits, not wicked men. General Washington and all the men that labored for the purpose were inspired of the Lord. These were good men. These were honest men. They were choice spirits, not wicked men. I'm not sure they deserve to have statues ripped down about them. But that's sort of the feeling of the time. Okay? But you and I should put it in our hearts. These are really, really good people. the best spirits, the choicest spirits the God of heaven had available to do this work. That's who they are. That's what they did. There was a young American artilleryman fighting in the battle, that fought in the Battle of New York in 1776. And I just love this little quote from him. His name was Lieutenant Shaw. "I firmly believe if heaven had not something very great in store for America, we should before this have been a ruined people." He's bearing his testimony. I'm just a guy on the field. I'm just a guy that does what I'm told. I'm just a guy that shoots my artillery piece. But in my heart, I firmly believe that heaven had something greater in store for America. And if not, we would have been a ruined people, a real ruined people. That's a powerful testimony. Just a few thoughts at the end. Britain had to win the war. The Americans just had to not lose the war. You see the difference? If we just don't lose the war, we'll be okay. Britain had to win. They had to subject the colonists. But the colonists just had to stay on the move. George Washington said, "We are going to fight a war of posts," meaning we'll just move from post to post. We'll just stay out of their clutches, out of their grasp. And the more they could move the British Army inland, not on the coast, but into New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, the more they could move them inland, the harder they made it for that army, because they've got to keep their supply lines open. They couldn't count on foraging off the land because the colonists were not leaving them anything to forage. So they've got to feed their men, supply their men with their supply chain, that if they were in Boston, it's a simple thing. If they're just in Philadelphia, it's a simple thing. Now we keep moving inland. They keep stretching them out. George Washington just kept moving. Just kept moving. Just trying to not lose the war. And the British are going, dang it, we need to win the war. Well, you got to catch us first. All right? He'd just keep moving from post to post. Just don't lose the war. And with God's help, that's exactly what they did. They did not lose the war for long enough that they eventually won the war. They eventually beat the greatest army on the earth. And they eventually got them to submit. And they freed themselves from Great Britain. And then 11 years later, well, a few years later, they created the nation. And the nation allowed the restoration to happen here. Any closing comments? Thoughts, Bobby?
You know, about 10 years ago, I flew to New Hampshire, and I rented a car and drove along that New England coast, around that area. I was so impressed with the forestation of that area. It's thick. It's so thick. And I thought to myself, how did the British, who are used to lining up, fight? How could they fight and win a war with people who could hide behind any one of those trees or in those trees? They couldn't map that forest. And I thought, they couldn't have had a chance. I mean, and they wore red coats, which even made it worse.
It was a whole different battle scheme because the colonists, you know, they had a lot of wars with Indians. Indians are great, hiding behind trees. Colonists learned to fight like that. And the British would get really upset with them. Come out and fight like men. No, we're just trying to fight to stay alive. That's all we really want, fight to stay alive. And the British were very frustrated by not being able to set up their battle lines and just have these battle lines moving together. It really drove them nuts. And then the red coats. And officers wore different color of red. It was a different dye. And officers would wear this thing over their throat called like a gorget or something. And it would just be a sign of an officer. So the colonists would just say, shoot those guys. Just shoot those guys. Because when the officers go down, the soldiers are going, well, what do you want us to do? Just pick off the officers. The different color red coats, look on their throat. And they all wore them proudly. I'm an officer, and now I'm a dead officer. So it was different kinds of fighting. All right? And the God of battles, was with the colonists. And like Lieutenant Shaw says, God had something for this country. If not, we would have been gone. Seriously. All right. I'll bear you my testimony that God did this. And He did it for us, and He did it for the world. And He did it to establish His gospel on the earth so that we could build temples. We could build temples in the Utah Valley one stone's throw from each other. Okay? They're everywhere. And I am so happy that more people can go and more people can do temple work. I am so happy about that. God did this to establish the gospel of Jesus Christ in this great sanctified nation. And I leave that testimony with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.